Hello, and welcome to Dark Hearts with Stacy Lee. Before we begin, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you want to support me. You can also join my Patreon. We have a big goal there, and I will talk about that at the end of the video. I've got a confession to make. Although I'm not really a believer, I'm a sucker for a good cryptid story. If I've seen one low-budget Bigfoot documentary, I've seen 100, and I have. I spend a lot of time in the woods and in the desert, and one of my favorite things is to watch these types of films while in the woods or the desert. I love to hear stories about the Mothman, the Jersey Devil, the Yeti, and today I'm bringing you a story that has kept me fascinated for many, many years. This is the story of the Enfield Monster. I'm your host, Stacy Lee. Let's begin. Our story begins in Enfield, Illinois, which is a small village in White County. There are under 1,000 people in the entire county. It's very rural and very sparsely populated, with only about 150 families living there today. They do grow a little bit of corn, but it's not a farming community. It's not a ranching town. Most of the people work in retail or food service, and their homes are pretty isolated. This is the large high school that has been standing in the village since 1935. This is the post office, which has been remodeled and is a little bit more modern. And this is the downtown area. As you can see, there's just not much there. They have an annual festival called Mule Days that takes place on the first Saturday in October. There's a parade and a baby beauty pageant and a car show. This is very much small town Americana. Very much something you'd see in a neo-Western. The people are friendly and neighborly, and they like a slower paced life. The nights are especially quiet in the isolated area, and the wind whispers through the fields as the nocturnal critters come out to eat. It's a very traditional small town with one major exception. Many people believe that Enfield is home to an actual monster. At about 10 o'clock at night on the evening of April 25th, 1973, a man named Henry McDaniel arrived home to find his kids in a panic. The kids had heard something outside the house and they were terrified. Henry and his wife listened to the kids and were trying to calm them down when they heard a scratching sound at the front door. Henry was worried that it might be a hungry bear trying to break the door down, get inside and get some food. Henry grabbed his gun and his flashlight and he stepped outside the front door. The wind was howling that night and it made a high-pitched whistling sound through the woodlaps on the outside of Henry's house. Henry stared out into the darkness and listened to the wind, and then he saw it. There, standing between two of his rose bushes, was a shocking sight. A creature that Henry knew was not a bear or a dog or a wolf. It was a monster. Henry said the monster froze and stared at him as he watched it. He claims it had large pink eyes that were each as big around as the head of a flashlight. Henry said the monster had 3 legs, so it stood like a tripod. It had 2 short little arms sticking out of its squatty body, and it had claws. Henry said the monster stood about 4.5 feet tall and was gray in color. He said the body was almost human-like. Even though he was in shock, Henry raised his .22 and began to fire. He pulled the trigger 4 times and one of the shots hit the creature. When the bullet struck, the monster let out a loud hiss, Henry said, like a wildcat. And then Henry watched in astonishment as the creature shot into motion, traveling away from him, covering 50 feet with only 3 jumps. Henry could not believe what he had just seen. He went back inside the house, locking the doors behind him, and then he called the police. Officers arrived the next morning at the McDaniel residence and listened, some with terror and others with amusement. And then they saw the evidence. Here on the side of Henry's house, which was white at the time of the incident, is a screen-covered window. As you can see, the screen has been shredded to bits. The entire lower left corner has been ripped away, and there is a second large hole in the middle of the screen. The police looked at the damage with concern, and one of the officers later said the hair on the back of his neck stood up. One of the officers pointed at the exterior door jamb. There were deep, thin claw marks in the wood. Then Henry showed the officer the footprints. In the soft dirt, not far from the house, the police officers could clearly see there were some strange-looking animal prints in the earth. Henry said, "Look at those. They look a little like a dog's print, but there's 6 toes." The cops could see the prints. They looked at each other and wondered just what is going on here. Police noted in their report that Henry McDaniel was, quote, rational and sober and very matter-of-fact. Henry wasn't known to be a crackpot or a person lost in fantasy or drink or mental illness, and he was insistent he knew what he saw. Before long, the media arrived at the McDaniel house. Reporters asked all kinds of questions about the monster, about the screen over the window, about the prints, and Henry answered them just like he had for the police. When asked if he thought the police were going to catch the monster, Henry said, "If they do find it, there will be more than one, and they won't be from this planet. I can tell you that." That sensational quote was printed in the newspaper stories all throughout the area the next day and for weeks to come. People were fascinated, and they were scared. Was there really a monster roaming their little village? And if so, what were they going to do about it? Then the press found out that Henry McDaniel wasn't the only Enfield resident claiming to have seen the monster. A 10-year-old boy named Greg Garrett told his parents that he saw the monster about a half hour before Henry McDaniel did. Area reporters arrived at the Garrett home to interview little Greg, who told them that he had seen the creature in his yard and that it had stepped on his feet, tearing his tennis shoes to shreds. Greg's story ran in the paper the next day, and people were terrified to learn that not one, but 2 people were claiming to have seen this monster. Now, what they didn't know at the time was that there would later be claims that Greg Garrett was making the whole story up. He hadn't seen a thing. There are claims that as a young adult, Greg told researchers at Western Illinois University that his sighting was a hoax. There are also claims that Greg did no such thing, that he still claims he saw the monster. This is the nature of these kinds of urban legends and not so urban legends. 2 weeks went by, and then on May 6th, Henry McDaniel called the local radio station claiming to have seen the monster again. This sighting took place at 3 a.m. Henry, who was angry and upset about some of the things that were being said about him around town, was having a hard time sleeping. He was awake during the wee hours of the morning when he saw something outside his window. He looked closer, and there, on the L&N railroad tracks not far from Henry's house, was the monster, jumping from trestle to trestle. Not in a hurry, just making its way down the tracks. I would absolutely love to see something like that. Henry did not shoot at the monster. He didn't even yell at it. He just watched as it hopped down the railway. This second sighting triggered the formation of a search party. You can picture it, can't you? A bunch of scared townspeople gathering their guns and their flashlights, a la Frankenstein's monster, ready to hunt this creature down and kill it, to rid their town of it, to protect the citizens in the area. The search party that formed included a local radio station's news director named Rick Rainbow, the 70s. And before the search had gone on too long, Rick claims he saw something. As the search party walked up and down the railroad tracks just off Prairie Street, members of that party saw an ape-like creature standing in an abandoned building near Henry McDaniel's house. The creature wasn't moving. It didn't run away. It just stood and stared at the people in the search party. Rick Rainbow had brought along some recording equipment. He claims that he turned it on and began to record, and he would later claim that he caught some of the cries coming from the creature on tape. Now, most of these searchers wanted the creature dead, so one of the men took a shot at it. The creature immediately disappeared into the trees behind the abandoned building. Word of this sighting spread like crazy. Now, there was a group of residents claiming they had seen the monster, and that was on top of the claims made by Henry McDaniel and Greg Garrett, which, remember, at the time they all believed to be real. Henry McDaniel went on the local radio station and gave an interview. It said that the town pretty much shut down on that day to listen to him speak. Henry repeated what he'd told the police and the newspaper reporters. He saw a three-legged monster with a squatty little body, two short arms that protruded from it, and it had big eyes that glowed pink and were as big around as the end of a flashlight. Then a call came into police dispatch. Local residents were calling in to report hearing shots being fired in the area. The police arrived at the neighborhood to find 5 men from out of town who had traveled to Enfield to try and get photographs of the monster. The men were in a panic and told the police that they had seen the monster. That's why they had fired their guns. The men claimed that they were scared for their lives and had brought their guns only for protection, shooting just because they had to. However, the men had been drinking on their monster quest, and so some of the officers didn't believe them. They chalked it up to guys out drinking, and they actually cited some of the men for hunting violations. The story spread to the Chicago Daily News, and that led to reporters in Pennsylvania and other neighboring states picking up on the story as well. When the story got out about the 5 monster hunters, other people followed suit. Everyone wanted to be the one to catch what the press was now calling the Enfield Monster. Cryptozoologists were called in, and they supposedly listened to the recordings made by Rick Rainbow of the monster screaming. What happened to those tapes? You would think they'd be there readily available for anyone to listen to, wouldn't you? I couldn't find them anywhere. I looked and looked. So I don't know. I realized people didn't used to document things like they do now, so there is a very good possibility that the tapes were simply lost. Or perhaps they didn't have anything on them at all. The theories were, as you can imagine, plentiful. Many people believed there was an actual monster in the area, and gun sales in neighboring towns went up. The people who did not believe there was a monster were mainly in agreement that there was a valid and rational explanation for the sightings. A kangaroo escaped from a nearby zoo. This would explain the short little arms, the squatty little body, and the 3 legs. Only, of course, there weren't 3 legs. It was the kangaroo's 2 legs and a tail that looked like a leg. I'm laughing because I dated a guy who was in a band called Third Leg. Anyway, well, when Henry McDaniel heard this kangaroo theory, he was actually angry. Henry had served in the military, and part of his military service took place in Australia. Henry had actually owned a pet kangaroo while he was in the military, and he knew what a kangaroo looked like. Thank you very much. He was insulted, and he was mad that people would think him so simple as to mistake a kangaroo for a monster. On top of that, he said, a kangaroo couldn't do the kind of damage that had been done to his house. A man in Ohio even came forward stating that he had kept a pet kangaroo named Macy, and Macy had gone missing the previous year, and that made Henry even more angry. He kept telling reporters, he kept telling people in the neighborhood, it was not a kangaroo. Now, for whatever reason, WWKI, which was the radio station that employed Rick Rainbow, became very interested and invested in this story. WWKI was based out of this building in Kokomo, Indiana, and listeners were intrigued with the story. Rick Rainbow was insistent that not only had he seen the creature, but his crew had as well. Rick never backed down on his claims that they saw the monster standing in an abandoned house and that they captured its screams on tape. Some people believe the tapes that I couldn't find were given to this man, Loren Coleman, who is head of the Cryptozoology Museum. If Loren has the tapes, he isn't sharing them, at least not now. Sightings of the Enfield Monster continued for the next several years. Every once in a while, there would be a group of teenage boys or young men that would go out hunting it. They'd usually end up with nothing but a ticket and a stiff warning from the sheriff. But that didn't deter the next group, and there were people in that area going out over and over, convinced that there was more than deer lurking in the woods around them. A team of researchers at Western Illinois University began to investigate the sightings of the Enfield Monster. The investigation was headed by a man named David L. Miller, who was quite convinced that what they had on their hands was a case of social contagion. When we hear the words social contagion, many people think about things like the belief that celebrities die in threes, or that if one student at a high school takes themselves out, others may do the same. But there are lesser extreme examples of social contagion as well. Smiling is the first one that comes to my mind. When someone smiles, others smile back. Sneezing and yawning can be socially contagious as well. But David Miller and his team were diving deeper than that. I found the actual published study from 1978. You can see here it was written by David L. Miller, Kenneth J. Midas, and Richard A. Mathers. The paper is a case study on the monster sighting in a rural community, and it's presented and examined from an alternative perspective. The authors of the paper used the example of the infamous War of the Worlds broadcast that occurred in 1939. I'm sure most of you are familiar with that, but briefly, in October 1938, Orson Welles narrated an adaptation of H.G. Wells' novel, The War of the Worlds, in which the Earth is invaded by aliens. They called them Martians back then. People who weren't aware that the reading was from a novel heard the broadcast on the radio and actually believed that the Earth was being attacked by invaders from outer space. Panic spread, and it spread quickly because apparently the show wasn't very popular, but people were telling others about it. And it spread like the game of telephone. The few people that had seen the broadcast were telling it, but by the time it got down the line, the story was much bigger, than it really was. The authors of the Enfield papers state that they believe the monster sightings were similar to what happened during the War of the Worlds broadcast, that someone made the claim and that triggered others in this very rural and isolated area to believe that they were seeing the same thing. It's basically a form of suggestive thought that gets buried in the public consciousness, or subconscious, which would it be? It's kind of like how nowadays everyone believes, but it's not proven. Like, remember how your parents would tell you it was illegal to drive with the dome lights on inside the car? That's something pretty much everyone has heard. And a lot of people aren't sure if it's true or not, but just in case, they don't drive with the dome lights on. You know what I mean? There are a lot of other examples of groupthink and group. I'm just going to stop there because I ain't trying to get in trouble today. But you have all seen groupthink situations, especially recently. And the problem nowadays is that some people think they're witnessing a groupthink event when in reality, they are in the groupthink event. You know what I'm saying? As time went on, people kind of split into two camps. There were those who knew Henry McDaniel. He was a war veteran. He was a respected member of the community. He was a rational and level-headed man. They weren't sure they completely believed Henry, but they respected him enough not to talk poorly of him. Then there was another camp that kind of turned against Henry over the years, and some of them were even angry that he had brought so much attention, negative attention, to their little village that people live in because they want to be left alone. Theories came out about bobcats and bears. But the truth of the matter is there's only one small species of bobcat in Illinois, and there aren't very many bears. Also, these are people who are accustomed to living on the prairies and in this very rural area. They know what kind of animals are around. The older folks, which Henry McDaniel was at the time, had grown up in that area and had lots of experience with the area wildlife. Still, Henry stuck by his story that is not what he had seen. It was not an animal. Researchers stayed on top of the case and discovered that decades before this, something similar had occurred. Between 1941 and 1942, in Mount Vernon, Illinois, there was a string of sightings of a mysterious leaping beast terrorizing the local people. Mount Vernon is about 40 miles away from Enfield. People in Mount Vernon who saw the creature described it as baboon-like in appearance and able to leap from 20 to 40 feet in one jump. But a lot of people in the Mount Vernon area actually think the creature that was seen in the 40s is what they call the devil monkey. That's another cryptid that we'll cover at some point. but others believe it could be the same thing that Henry McDaniel and the radio crew and maybe Greg saw on that night. The Mount Vernon creature has been blamed for killing area livestock and pets, and there are even those who believe it mutilates cattle. Could this be the same creature as the Enfield Monster? This story has become legend in the Midwest, and even historical societies take it seriously. It's part of the history and the lore of the area. The Illinois State Historical Society has a display and numerous articles written on the sightings. Henry McDaniel died and his property was sold. This is its current owner, Brent Walters. He knew of the story of the monster before buying the property. He said he grew up with the story. No, he hasn't seen the monster. He isn't sure what to make of the entire thing. He tells a documentarian that there is a neighbor still living that was a teenager when all of this happened, but that he is a very private person and probably won't answer the door if the film producer goes and knocks. Everyone in the area is getting older. I feel like somebody needs to go talk to him. Brent says most people in the area just want to forget about the whole thing, but it seems that the legend has only grown. There are countless scary stories and creepypastas and documentaries about cryptids, and the Enfield Monster is now firmly entrenched on the list of monsters we find so fascinating. There hasn't been a reported sighting in many, many years, which leads us to the latest theory. That is that the Enfield Monster was an alien whose spaceship must have crash landed here on Earth, stranding the monster who was simply hiding in the Illinois woods where it crashed, desperately hoping and waiting for rescue. Perhaps the alien was friendly and went looking for help when it was scratching on Henry McDaniel's house. Or perhaps it was hungry. People say that if it were an alien, that would certainly explain why so many people saw it in such a short span of time, and it would certainly explain why the sightings stopped so suddenly. The alien was most likely rescued and taken back to its home planet, and that is why it hasn't been seen since. I'm not a big believer in these kinds of stories, but I do find them endlessly fascinating. They say so much about us as humans and so much about our culture. There is something in our psyche that needs to believe in the monster under the bed. We want to believe that there is something out there to get us. Is it an instinct buried deep in our amygdala, our lizard brain, that dates back to Neanderthal days when the monsters in the dark were very real and that fear was meant to keep us alive? Is the fear of monsters left over from a time when humans didn't understand what the stars were or what caused the lightning and the thunder, and so we're left to imagine the worst things possible? Or are people really seeing strange things? Lights in the stars, Bigfoot in the mountains, and Mothman in the sky? And did they really see a three-legged, pink-eyed monster in a little town in Illinois all those years ago? Thank you for joining me today on Dark Hearts with Stacey Lee. Hit the like button if you liked the video, subscribe to the channel if you want to see more from me, and you can always join my Patreon. We have a fundraiser going on right now. This is what the thumbnail looks like, and you can watch this short little video. It explains everything. But we are raising money to donate to police departments that have cold case DNA in storage that has not been tested. There are thousands of sexual assault kits sitting in refrigeration that have never been tested, and we want to get some of those tested. We're going to raise the money. The kits cost between $500 and $750 a kit. We're going to pick a case, get that kit tested, and hopefully solve the crime. Even if we don't solve the crime, we get that perpetrator's DNA into the system forever. And if they're tied to other crimes, we might help with that. If you've got a few extra shekels, I know a good place to put them. I want you to know how much I appreciate you. I say it all the time, but it really is the truth. I enjoy our conversations, and I really enjoy the community that we're building here. Stay safe, my friends, and be kind to each other. And I will see you next time on Dark Hearts with Stacey Lee. Bye.